And we're back. So, Tim, let me ask you this follow-up question. Was the BP disaster, was that a failure of capitalism?
I don't think so at all. Many people will point to this as an example of a rapacious industry that doesn't care about the environment. I think that's far from the truth. If you look at the actual circumstances of that oil spill, we find that there are so many government interventions that encouraged that kind of risk-taking behavior on the part of a company like BP.
Mm-hmm.
The government passed laws that gave oil companies incentives to drill farther offshore, where the risk is necessarily far greater. They
prohibited them from drilling closer to shore where they wanted to.
Well, in the eastern part of the Gulf, there's a government ban on drilling. So if you constrain the area in which they can drill in shallow water, they're going to be incentivized to move further offshore in areas where they can drill.
And they capped the risk also at $75 million.
Yes, after the Exxon Valdez, they capped the risk at $75 million, and that can be waived in certain cases, but it certainly reduces the care that a company will take to avoid risk.
And the companies are not really incentivized to go and get external insurance because that basically satisfies the government's requirements.
Correct. And we see similar things in other industries, like the nuclear power generation is also, they have a risk cap. I'm not particularly concerned about the risk of nuclear power, but whenever the government's capping a risk, that's going to reduce the care that the company will take.
Mm-hmm. So talk about this concept that you mentioned, neglected development. What does that mean?
Yes. Well, I had an associate of mine who took some students on a tour of the coastal Atlantic states. And he said, well, the market has produced this aesthetically obnoxious development in coastal areas. He says that the asphalt contractors and the burger merchants have just taken over. We get strip malls and big box stores, and the idea among those who hold to this anti-capitalistic mentality is that we need the government to control development.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I like environmental amenities.
Mm-hmm.
I like uncrowded beaches. I like marshes. I enjoy going out into the open spaces of the world and enjoying myself. But it's not a solution to those problems of...
You also like a burger when you want one.
Well, I sure do. I like those things, and I want access to them.
Mm-hmm.
But people seem to think that urban sprawl is entirely a market phenomenon.
Well, what are the alternatives for people?
Well, if you look at the alternative to a market-oriented decision about what to do with resources, well, government ends up restricting those resources, access to those resources, so fewer people can enjoy those environmental amenities. We end up with an elitist access to the resort regions. Either that, or we end up with prices for access that are far below what the market would charge, and therefore they're overcrowded. Mm-hmm. So you get a combination of either overcrowded or underused natural resources. Neither is optimal.
Discuss a little bit more this idea you just mentioned about concealed elitism. What does that mean?
Yes. If the government's going to make decisions about who gets access, it's necessarily going to be a politically determined access. So rather than the highest value users getting to enjoy the environmental amenities, whoever's got the political pull ends up with access. This is not ideal.
Mm-hmm.
We have government deciding who gets what.
And so you can look at this by just looking who pays for the roads and sewers to the new, more exclusive developments.
Well, that was another point I made yesterday, that if you want to understand urban sprawl, understand that the costs of development are largely being subsidized by governments, extending the roads.
The general people.
Yes,
that's right.
Of course.
So that's the concealed elitism part of the equation. So what's the real danger of having government in charge of this more exclusive land use?
I think that if you have government trying to plan resources and land use or any other kind of resource, it's going to end up being used in a way that is not producing the most benefit for society. You certainly have different ideas about how land should be used, whose ideas then will be acted upon.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if you go to political determination of land use, then we end up with a situation in which there's less access except for those who are politically favored.
And so, as you mentioned, the real danger is handing over land to people who have elections to win rather than money to make.
Yes, my colleague argued that it's a terrible thing for land use to be driven by profit. Well, I would say it's a terrible thing for land use to be driven by who has an election to win. Politicians have a very short time horizon. They just want to win the next election.
Okay, here comes number 6. Corporate scandals prove that capitalism doesn't work.
Well, this is one of the ones that I hear so often, and it's groundless, but it keeps coming up, so we ought to deal with it. There's nothing about capitalism that endorses fraud. Nothing about capitalism endorses unethical business practices. And in fact, if you look at what happens to these companies after a scandal is discovered, the companies usually go bankrupt, or at least the market discounts the value of their stock. The company is effectively punished by the market for this kind of behavior.
Yeah, the market actually cleanses the behavior.
Yes, there's a constant purging of this kind of defrauding behavior. But then if you look at what...
And, I'd like to interject
Sure.
here is the again, as a small business owner, that's because the market requires the trust of people.
Yes.
And so if that trust is violated, then those that really want to continue to be in the market have an enormous incentive to get that crap out of here.
Right.